The moment an avoidant person realizes you no longer need their approval to feel whole, something inside them breaks that has nothing to do with love. It is not sadness. It is not longing. It is the quiet, terrifying collapse of a script they had been running since childhood, a script that told them control equals safety and distance equals power. Self-respect does something an avoidant person cannot predict, cannot manipulate, and cannot outrun. It does not chase, it does not punish, it simply stands still, calm and unshaken, while their entire internal system searches for a reaction that never comes. Somewhere beneath their silence, a question begins to surface, one they have spent years avoiding. What happens to my identity when someone stops needing me to feel important? This is not a story about winning someone back. This is a story about what self-respect exposes in a person who built their entire sense of control around other people's emotional dependency. And once that exposure begins, nothing about their inner world stays the same. Human beings do not fall in love with people. They fall in love with the feeling those people generate inside their nervous system, and this single distinction explains almost everything that goes wrong between an avoidant person and someone who finally learns to respect themselves. An avoidant does not actually crave distance. What an avoidant craves is the illusion of control over how close another person is allowed to get, because closeness, to their nervous system, once meant danger, unpredictability, or the threat of losing themselves entirely. Nobody teaches a child this lesson directly. It gets absorbed in silence, in inconsistency, in moments where love felt conditional on performance or invisibility. By the time that child becomes an adult, distance has become a language of safety, and intimacy has become a language of threat, and no logical conversation can undo a pattern that was built before language even existed. Self-respect is dangerous to this system, not because it is aggressive, but because it refuses to participate in the choreography the avoidant unconsciously expects. Most people, when hurt by distance, either collapse into pursuit or explode into anger, and both reactions, strangely enough, hand the avoidant exactly what their nervous system is searching for. Pursuit confirms that they are needed. Anger confirms that they still hold emotional power. Self-respect offers neither. It removes the avoidant from the center of the emotional universe, and for a person whose entire identity has quietly orbited around being the one who decides how close or how far love is allowed to travel, this removal feels less like heartbreak and more like erasure. There is a particular kind of confusion that rises in an avoidant person when someone stops reacting to their withdrawal, and very few people ever describe it accurately. It is not relief. It is not indifference. It is a disorienting, almost vertigo-like sensation, because the entire internal map they use to measure their own value has just lost its reference point. If the other person no longer chases, no longer negotiates, no longer bends, then what does that say about the avoidant's power? What does that say about their identity? This question does not arrive gently. It arrives like a small earthquake beneath a house that was built assuming the ground would never move. Empaths, on the other side of this dynamic, carry their own hidden architecture of self-destruction, one that mainstream relationship content almost never explains correctly. The common narrative paints the empath as the giving, self-sacrificing partner who simply loves too much, but this framing conveniently ignores the deeper psychological transaction taking place beneath the surface. An empath often attaches their sense of worth to their ability to emotionally repair another human being. Healing an avoidant becomes, without their conscious awareness, proof that they matter, proof that they are capable, proof that their presence has weight in the world. This is not weakness. This is a survival strategy formed in environments where love had to be earned through emotional labor, where being needed felt safer than simply being wanted. The tragedy inside this pairing is not that one person withdraws and the other pursues. The tragedy is that both people are unconsciously trying to solve childhood wounds using each other as the instrument, and neither one realizes they are doing it. The avoidant tests distance to confirm they still control the emotional temperature of the relationship, and the empath closes that distance to confirm they are still capable of earning love through effort. Two entirely different wounds, operating on two entirely different timelines, colliding inside the same relationship, mistaken by both people as romantic incompatibility rather than what it actually is, which is two nervous systems performing separate survival rituals at the exact same moment. Once self-respect enters this equation, the entire ritual collapses, but not in the way people expect. Self-respect does not simply stop the empath from chasing, it removes the empath's need to prove their worth through repair. This shift is far more radical than most people realize because it means the empath is no longer available to play their half of the unconscious performance. Without a pursuer, the avoidance distance stops producing its intended effect. Silence used to generate anxiety in the other person. Now silence generates nothing. Withdrawal used to summon reassurance-seeking behavior. Now withdrawal summons stillness. For the first time, the avoidant is forced to sit inside their own distance without an audience reacting to it, and this experience is far more uncomfortable than heartbreak. It is confrontation. Confrontation with the self is the one experience an avoidant has spent their entire adult life architecting their behavior to avoid. Their independence, their emotional unavailability, their carefully maintained boundaries, all of it was never really about not needing people. It was about never being alone long enough with their own internal world to feel whatever unprocessed pain lives underneath their control. Self-respect, coming from someone they once relied on to manage their emotional environment, strips away the external distraction. There is no longer a pursuer to manage, no longer a wound to soothe by controlling someone else's proximity. There is only the avoidant, alone, inside a silence they created, forced to listen to whatever they have been outrunning. Most people believe an avoidant fears intimacy. This is only partially true, and the incomplete version of this idea has misled an entire generation of relationship content. What an avoidant actually fears is exposure, the moment when someone gets close enough to witness the parts of them that feel unlovable, inadequate, or fundamentally flawed. Distance was never really about pushing people away. Distance was a form of self-protection disguised as independence. When someone with self-respect refuses to chase, refuses to shrink, and refuses to perform emotional gymnastics to earn basic consistency, the avoidant is suddenly deprived of the one tool that always worked before, which was the ability to control how close exposure was allowed to get. This is where the first hidden truth of this entire dynamic reveals itself, a truth almost never discussed honestly. An avoidant does not actually want distance to succeed. Somewhere beneath the surface, a part of them is quietly hoping someone will refuse to be pushed away, not so they can chase them, but so they can prove, once and for all, that they are not as unlovable as they secretly believe. Self-respect does something extraordinary here. It refuses to chase, but it also refuses to disappear in humiliation. It stands, calm and immovable, communicating a message the avoidant has never received before, which is that their withdrawal does not define someone else's worth, and it certainly does not need to be managed, fixed, or feared. This calm presence becomes the very thing the avoidance nervous system was secretly testing for, and its arrival, without begging, without desperation, without collapse, creates a psychological rupture inside them that no amount of distance can repair. Power, in the way most people define it, has almost nothing to do with what an avoidant person is actually chasing beneath their behavior. They are not chasing dominance. They are chasing certainty, because uncertainty, to a nervous system shaped by inconsistency, feels indistinguishable from danger. This is why an avoidant will often create distance not when things are going badly, but precisely when things are going well, when closeness starts to feel real, when vulnerability starts to feel required. The relationship becomes too good, too steady, too emotionally exposed, and instead of running toward that steadiness, something inside them pulls the emergency brake. Self-respect confuses this mechanism entirely because it refuses to treat the withdrawal as an emergency. There is no scrambling, no bargaining, no silent interrogation of what was done wrong. There is only a quiet refusal to abandon one's own dignity in exchange for someone else's comfort with distance, and this refusal becomes the first real evidence the avoidant has ever encountered that stability does not always disappear the moment they test it. Testing, though rarely named honestly, sits at the center of almost every avoidant pattern, and very few people are willing to admit what this testing actually reveals. An avoidant does not consciously decide to test another person's loyalty. The testing happens instinctively, automatically, the same way a hand pulls back from a stove without a person deciding to feel pain first. Distance becomes a subconscious experiment designed to answer one question over and over again, which is whether love, this time, will behave the way love behaved before. Will it collapse? Will it disappear? Will it turn cold, punishing, or conditional the moment imperfection shows up? Self-respect answers this question in a way the avoidant has never experienced because it does not collapse, but it also does not perform the desperate, anxious loyalty the avoidant unconsciously expects. It simply remains consistent, unaffected by the test, unwilling to prove its worth through suffering. There is a second hidden truth buried inside this dynamic, one that almost no one addresses directly. The avoidant is not actually afraid of losing the other person. They are afraid of discovering that the other person was never truly needed to begin with, because that discovery threatens the entire identity they built around being the emotionally unattainable one. If someone can walk away from an avoidant with peace instead of devastation, it shatters a belief the avoidant has quietly relied upon for years. The belief that their presence, their approval, their emotional availability holds a kind of gravitational pull that others cannot escape. Self-respect breaks this gravitational illusion instantly. It proves that a person can love deeply, invest sincerely, and still remain fully intact without the avoidant's validation, and this proof does something no argument, no confrontation, and no emotional plea could ever accomplish. It removes the avoidant from the throne they did not even realize they were sitting on. Every throne, however, comes with isolation, and this is the part of avoidant psychology that most people overlook entirely. Being emotionally unreachable might feel like power in the moment, but power without connection eventually curdles into loneliness, and loneliness, left unexamined, eventually curdles into self-contempt. An avoidant who successfully pushes everyone into a manageable emotional distance often ends up alone with a version of themselves they do not actually like, surrounded by admiration but starved of intimacy, surrounded by attention but incapable of receiving closeness without panic. Self-respect, ironically, becomes the mirror that finally reflects this isolation back to them, not through confrontation, but through absence. When someone stops performing the emotional labor of managing an avoidant's fear, the avoidant is left alone with the very thing they built their entire personality to avoid feeling, which is the ache of never having let anyone close enough to matter. Grief at this point enters the picture in a form most people never expect. It does not arrive as grief over losing the person. It arrives as grief over losing the illusion that distance was ever truly protecting them. This is one of the rarest psychological insights inside this entire dynamic, and it deserves to be said plainly. An avoidant does not grieve the relationship first. They grieve the collapse of their own coping mechanism, the realization that the wall they built to protect themselves from pain has also protected them from everything that made pain worth risking in the first place, which is connection, intimacy, and being fully known by another human being. Self-respect does not cause this grief directly. It simply removes the noise, the chase, the emotional distraction that used to keep this grief buried beneath the surface. Empaths, meanwhile, undergo their own quiet transformation once self-respect becomes their operating principle instead of self-sacrifice. This transformation is rarely discussed with the depth it deserves. Most content treats self-respect as a boundary technique, a strategy to make someone else behave differently, but true self-respect has nothing to do with changing another person's behavior. It has everything to do with an empath finally severing the belief that their worth is measured by how much emotional weight they can carry for someone else. This shift is not cold. It is not detachment disguised as healing. It is the empath discovering, often for the first time, that love does not require self-erasure to be real, and that presence without self-abandonment is not only possible but far more powerful than the anxious, over-functioning love they once believed was necessary to keep someone close. Identity collapse is not a phrase most people associate with romantic dynamics, yet it is precisely what happens inside an avoidant when self-respect refuses to bend. Their sense of self was never built on authentic self-worth. It was built on the ability to regulate how emotionally available they allowed themselves to be, and on the predictable reactions that regulation produced in other people. Remove the predictable reaction, and the entire identity structure begins to wobble. This is why an avoidant confronted with genuine self-respect often experiences something disturbingly close to an identity crisis rather than simple heartbreak. They are not just losing a person. They are losing the reflection they used to measure themselves against, a reflection that always confirmed their power, their desirability, their control. Without that reflection, they are forced to ask a question their entire psychological architecture was designed to avoid, which is who they actually are when nobody is chasing them. Philosophically, this entire dynamic exposes something far larger than romantic attachment. It exposes the difference between control and character. Control can manufacture temporary safety, but it cannot manufacture peace, because peace requires trust, and trust requires the terrifying possibility of being hurt without collapsing. Character, unlike control, does not need to manipulate outcomes to feel secure. Self-respect is not a relationship tactic. It is a philosophical stance toward one's own existence, a refusal to outsource personal value to another human being's inconsistency. When an avoidant encounters this stance for the first time, they are not just witnessing a person who refuses to chase them. They are witnessing a version of strength their nervous system was never taught existed, a strength that does not need to dominate, manipulate, or withdraw in order to remain whole. Silence, once it stops being weaponized, becomes something an avoidant has almost never encountered before, which is neutral. For most of their relational history, silence functioned as a lever, something that could be pulled to generate anxiety, to summon reassurance, to test whether the other person's love could survive discomfort. When self-respect enters the picture, silence stops carrying that charge. It simply becomes space, unoccupied by manipulation and unoccupied by desperation, and this neutrality is far more disorienting to an avoidant than open conflict would ever be. Conflict at least confirms that the other person still cares enough to fight. Neutral silence confirms nothing except that the other person has stopped assigning their emotional stability to the avoidant's next move, and this absence of assigned meaning is precisely what forces the avoidant to sit with themselves instead of managing someone else's reaction to them. There is a strange irony buried inside human attachment that almost nobody names correctly, which is that people rarely respect what they can control, and they rarely value what never makes them work for it. An avoidant, throughout their life, may have unconsciously treated emotional availability as something to be rationed, believing that scarcity increases desirability. This belief is not entirely wrong, but it misunderstands why scarcity works. Scarcity does not create value through absence alone. It creates value because it forces another person to confront their own capacity to remain grounded without constant reassurance. Self-respect achieves the same psychological effect, but through an entirely different mechanism because it does not withhold love to manufacture longing. It simply refuses to distort itself in order to be chosen, and this refusal ends up producing a far deeper form of respect than manipulation ever could because it is not performance. It is authenticity operating without apology. A hidden contradiction lives inside almost every avoidant's inner world, one that rarely gets acknowledged even by the avoidant themselves. They often believe they are protecting the relationship by creating distance, when in reality, distance is usually what erodes the relationship they claim to be protecting. This contradiction persists because the avoidant is not actually reacting to the current relationship. They are reacting to an old, unresolved template stored somewhere beneath conscious awareness, a template built from earlier experiences where closeness led to disappointment, abandonment, or emotional suffocation. Every new relationship becomes an unconscious reenactment of that original wound, and the tragedy is that the avoidant genuinely believes they are protecting themselves in real time, unaware that they are actually protecting a version of themselves that no longer exists, defending against a threat that already happened years ago and is not present in the room today. Empaths often misunderstand this dynamic in a way that deepens their own suffering, believing that if they simply demonstrate enough patience, enough consistency, enough unconditional love, the avoidant will eventually feel safe enough to stop running. This belief, while compassionate, ignores an uncomfortable psychological reality. No amount of external patience can heal an internal wound that the other person has not consciously acknowledged themselves. Love can create the conditions for healing, but it cannot force healing to occur, because healing requires the wounded person to turn toward their own pain rather than continue outsourcing its management to someone else. Self-respect, once again, becomes the corrective force here, not because it heals the avoidant directly, but because it stops enabling the avoidance itself. It removes the buffer that allowed the avoidant to keep running without ever facing the exhaustion of the run. Exhaustion, interestingly, is rarely discussed as an avoidant experience, yet it may be one of the most defining features of their internal world. Maintaining perpetual emotional distance requires constant vigilance, a continuous internal monitoring system scanning for signs of closeness, obligation, or vulnerability that must be managed or deflected. This vigilance is tiring in a way most people never consider because it operates around the clock, even during moments that appear calm on the surface. When self-respect removes the chase, it inadvertently removes one of the primary triggers that keeps this vigilance activated. For the first time, there is no pursuit to monitor, no anxious energy to deflect, and in that unfamiliar stillness, the avoidant is forced to notice just how exhausted they have become from a lifetime of running without ever asking what they were actually running from. A third hidden truth emerges here, one almost never discussed inside mainstream attachment content. Avoidants frequently mistake independence for identity, believing that their ability to function without emotional need is proof of strength, when in reality the inability to tolerate closeness is often a symptom of unresolved fear rather than genuine self-sufficiency. True independence does not require the absence of connection. It requires the presence of connection without the collapse of self. An avoidant who cannot remain emotionally intimate without feeling consumed has not achieved independence. They have achieved avoidance disguised as autonomy, and self-respect, standing calmly on the other side of that avoidance, becomes an unintentional mirror exposing the difference between the two. Meaning, in the philosophical sense, rarely enters conversations about romantic attachment, yet it belongs at the very center of this entire dynamic. Human beings do not simply seek love, they seek evidence that they matter, that their existence produces some measurable effect on another person's world. An avoidance withdrawal often functions as an unconscious experiment in mattering, a way of testing whether their absence creates enough impact to prove their significance. Self-respect complicates this experiment in a profound way because it demonstrates that a person can matter deeply to someone without that person collapsing in their absence. Mattering, it turns out, was never dependent on someone else's inability to function without you. Mattering was always about the quality of connection during presence, not the intensity of desperation during absence. And this distinction alone dismantles decades of romantic mythology that mistakes chaos for depth. Or suffering, when examined honestly, often becomes a strange form of intimacy substitute for people who never learned how to tolerate calm connection. Some individuals, avoidance included, unconsciously associate emotional intensity with authenticity, believing that if a relationship does not hurt occasionally, it must not be real. This belief usually originates from environments where love was inconsistent, where peace felt suspicious, and where chaos, ironically, felt more familiar than safety. Self-respect refuses to participate in this manufactured intensity. It offers calm, consistency, and clarity instead. And for someone conditioned to associate love with unpredictability, this calm can initially feel foreign, even uncomfortable, before it eventually becomes the very thing they did not know they were starving for. Responsibility, ultimately, is the thread running quietly beneath every layer of this psychological unraveling. An avoidant cannot be forced into growth, cannot be shamed into vulnerability, and cannot be loved into healing against their will. Growth only occurs when a person becomes willing to take responsibility for the patterns they have spent years blaming on circumstance, timing, or the wrong partner. Self-respect does not demand this responsibility from the avoidant. It simply refuses to carry the responsibility on their behalf any longer, and in that refusal, something remarkable happens. The avoidant is finally left standing alone with the one relationship they have been avoiding their entire life, the relationship with themselves. And it is only inside that confrontation, uncomfortable and unavoidable, that any real transformation becomes possible. Self-respect was never a punishment aimed at someone else. It was always the return of ownership over one's own inner world. If you have been waiting for someone to finally see your worth before you allow yourself to feel whole, that waiting ends today, not through anger, not through distance, but through the quiet decision to stop outsourcing your value to a nervous system that was never taught how to receive it. Stand still the next time distance shows up in your life. Do not perform desperation. Do not perform indifference. Simply remain calm and intact, and let your presence speak a language avoidance has never learned to answer. The relationship worth saving may not be the one you are fighting for. It may be the one you have been neglecting with yourself. And in the end, the strongest thing a person can ever offer another human being is not proof that they cannot live without them, but proof that they absolutely can, and chose them anyway.